Hi, welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. This is the Q&A, which I suggested a little while ago. It's probably mostly going to be about SF. There'll be other things as well. I'm here in a minimalist hotel room in central Bath with the good doctor who'll be doing the interview. Onwards. Okay, so the Q&A. So just to let you know, if you watch This Country, where Kerry's mother is always off camera and she's got a crazy voice, we're going for a similar thing today with Dr. Timothy Coombs, who is a man of some repute, former manager of a specialist SF and comic shop. He's done lots of comic selling over the years. He has numerous degrees. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Timothy, but you have a BSc in chemistry.
Yep.
You have an MSc in chemistry.
No.
What's your other chemistry degree
It's
then?
PhD in chemistry.
PhD in chemistry, hence the good doctor.
And MSc in science, culture and communication.
Science, culture, communication. I believe that you did your dissertation on Michael Crichton.
Jurassic Park in particular, yeah.
Ah, right,
and
okay.
the way science is portrayed in Jurassic Park.
Right, okay. So there you go. So he's a proper scientist and he's a man of aesthetics. So try and ignore the book selling bulk here because we have been stuffing ourselves on croissants and the like. And I'm going to try and answer the questions which a lot of you kindly put down here, and we'll see what comes out of it. So go ahead, Maestro. Please interrogate me.
Okay, so first off, from Steve Donahue, your channel is such a glorious, knowledgeable celebration of the genre's past. But what about the future? Are you hopeful for 21st century science fiction gaining new converts and fanatics?
21st century science fiction. So I'm hopeful for there'll always be fanatics and converts to SF. For stuff published this century, I'm not very hopeful at the moment. Largely because currently there's an awful lot of the money in publishing is going to fantasy rather than SF, and this has been an issue since the early 80s, so it's a long-term issue. But I think part of the problem is that publishers, they regard the two things as the same, and they're increasingly becoming separate because far fewer writers are writing SF and fantasy, because a lot of the fantasy writers, quite frankly, couldn't write SF. But of course the publishers look, and the budget is there for the two things together. So when a new trend emerges in fantasy, which we're seeing at the moment, where there's lots of books by young female authors which are predominantly aimed at young female readers, the money is all going to them. So instead of seeing it as a new thing, putting more money in, they just flip the money over. So I am concerned about the future of 21st century SF. Also, we live in the future now. It's all a matter of perspective, of course, but part of the problem is that when you've lived through a lot of scientific changes. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember seeing the first moon landing. So I'm nearly 60, and the future is more upon us. So it's actually harder to write SF than ever before. So will it continue to be relevant? I don't know. Will it become more metaphoric? So I guess we'll see. I think this is that. I do think the most important part in science fiction history for genre SF, magazine-based SF, is from 1940 to 1990. Since then, I think development has been more stately and slower, but I think that's true of all the arts.
Well, I'm going to combine a couple here because they touch on the same things.
Okay, yeah.
It's about foreign language science fiction.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on it? People have tried reading Lem and the Strugatsky brothers, find them quite difficult, but wondered if there's anything you like from non-English SF or French writers in particular.
I think on the French one, I will confess to being, woefully ill-read on French SF, but there's never been much translated. Obviously, there's sort of pre-genre magazine stuff like Jules Verne, who suffered enormously from terrible translations, and there's some good ones now, and Verne is obviously important. And there's books like the De Fontenay book, which Dore published, which is a sort of space opera before Verne, which I've never read. Dore actually published quite a bit of French SF in the 70s, and I do need to pick that up. Of course, Philip K. Dick and Norman Spinrad are very popular in France. So I will confess, you know, that apart from the odd thing which is packaged as mainstream literature, it's always been quite hard to get SF. There's some Pierre Barbet on AB from Door, and I'm thinking of buying some of those soon. The one I really want, I can't find. I can't remember the title, but it looks like a horror novel, but I don't think it is. The interesting thing about SF in translation is it's always been hard to get. I read a book about 30 years ago, published by Routledge, called Japanese Science Fiction, View of Modern Society, I think was the subtitle. And, you know, you can get some Japanese SF now. The way it's published, it looks like manga, but it's not. Look inside, it's actual novels. So I would like to read more Japanese SF. I think the works of Kobo Abe, who sort of crosses between surrealism, modernism and SF. I mean, the Arc Segura is in print now, but Inter Ice Age 4 is the most famous novel, isn't? So it's a question of getting hold of it. There was a vogue in the 70s for Russian SF and Eastern Bloc SF. There's several anthologies. And I think with both Lem and the Strugatskys, part of the problem is that there's lots of different translators, so you don't get that consistency. I mean, one of my big things is Italian crime fiction, contemporary Italian crime fiction. And the beauty of that is there's literally about 2 or 3 people doing translations, so you get real consistency in looking at that as a subgenre. But with Lem and Strugatsky's it's hard. I mean, Lem, I've got loads of Lems, and they all translate by different people. They say that the translation of Solaris is bad, and there's only a good one on the Kindle version. That's what Scott Bradfield says, but I've always found Solaris really good. The Strugatskys, they vary. They seem to write in 2 modes. They seem to write in a straight ahead SF mode and in a more fabular mode, and the Russians have been doing that for like well over a century and a half. There's a sort of feel of the sort of folk tale of fabulation, things like Bulgakov, you know, and those sort of writers. They seem to have done these fantastic things, and they merge into SF. And in the Strugatskys, that's things like Snail on the Slope and Monday Begins with Saturday. But the more straight ahead things like Roadside Picnic, Hard to Be a God, Inhabited Island, aka Prisoner's Power. I say if you've struggled with Strugatsky or Lem, you've probably picked up the more spiky, difficult ones. So if you are interested in reading the easier ones, as it were, which are often better in my opinion, you know, just pop a comment in and I'll tell you which ones I think you should go back to. But, you know, it is hard to get stuff. Penguin's done some stuff recently by Essenbach, the German writer. I'd love to read some Italian SF, but I can't find any. So that Lavi Tidhar book, which has just come out, Anthology of World SF, I'll be looking at that. The trend at the moment is very much for Chinese, South Asian, African, which I do think is a bit of a political thing too. But, you know, it broadens it, so it's good. But yeah, I think almost all of us who like SF have, you know, really struggled to find material. And there is so much in the English-speaking world, you know. So there you go.
Right, next one is going to be contentious and might annoy the media death cultists.
Oh, okay.
What do you think about Alastair Reynolds' work?
I'm not really that enamoured of Al's work. I met him back in 2006. Very nice guy. He's from South Wales, like me. He's from Barry, so just outside Cardiff. Very, very nice chap. I read some of his early stuff, and I would admit I'm not a massive sort of, you know, space opera sort of guy, and Al obviously is a real scientist. But he's very much in that post-Ian Banks space opera revival thing, which isn't really my jam. I like words to say about that when I talk to Tom Toner. Tom and I do a little video about Ian Banks. But I mean, for example, I think I read Diamond Dog's Turquoise Days early on. That was one of them. And it just felt like M. John Harrison light to me. And if I'm going to read space opera, I want something that kind of rips my head off stylistically and that really sort of brings in the cognitive dissonance. And for me, I found that Al's work didn't do that. Obviously, he's massively popular. He got a 10-book deal with Gollancz about 10 years ago, which was £1 million, £100,000 a book, which shows you how popular he is. And, you know, there is a place for popular space opera writing, but it's not really my thing. I cleave to pioneers. I believe SF is an evolutionary genre, and I want to see writers who move things on. Like, for me, the example of a space opera I like is The Void Captain's Tale by Norman Spinrad, which dates back to the early 80s. And in that, the Starship has a female pilot, and it's powered by inducing orgasms in her, and I think that's radical. So if you talk about the new radical space opera that started in the late 80s and still dominates genre SF publishing in Britain today, it's a question of degree and experience. It's not exciting enough for me. Sorry if you like Al Reynolds, but there it is.
Okay, I thought that was coming. What book or author, in your opinion, is a good mix of hard SF and literary SF?
Well, this is an easy answer for that. I mean, I'm going to pick somebody who I really like, who is sadly little read these days, and that's Bob Shaw. Bob Shaw, his work is pretty much, I think you can get them on the Gateway sort of ebook thing that Gollancz do now, some of them. But what happened with Bob Shaw is that our friend Martin, who has his own sort of publishing thing, he tried to get the rights to Bob Shaw's novels after Shaw died, but allegedly his partner or wife or what have you wanted too much money for them, or wanted an unrealistic amount. But I mean, I would say if you read Bob Shaw, I mean, his career starts in the 60s, goes up to late 80s. He died quite young. He's a really nice man. If you read things like Other Days, Other Eyes, which to me is brilliant and original. It's about a type of glass that slows light, and it has the virtues of good literary fiction, but the tautness and excitement and intellectual sort of enjoyment you get from good hard SF. And Bob used to do science talks at conventions, which were supposed to be serious, but they would turn into giggle fests. But yeah, I mean, he did things big dumb object books like the Orbitsville trilogy, so I think Bob Shaw is a really, really great one. But there's no reason the two things should be separate. I mean, Gregory Benford did some good work combining sort of Joycean new wave SF and hard SF, but I'm not a massive hard SF reader. I am interested in science, I love it, but I think one of the problems with some of the writers who come from a scientific background is they're very rarely good prose stylists. So like Stephen Baxter, again, lovely guy, I did an event with Stephen, 20 years ago. And he's a heck of a nice guy, but I find his prose rather dull. So I would say Bob Shaw is the person I go back to. Of current people, I don't think there's anybody much writing who's really good at combining actual science with literature. There are moments in M. John Harrison's Light trilogy where he invokes all sorts of things. But I'm not a scientist, so it's a lot of the time you could be making it up for all I know. So there you go.
I know the answer. I know my answer to this one.
He knows his answer to this
What's your
one.
favourite science fiction cover?
My favourite science fiction cover? God, I've seen these questions, but I haven't thought about that one.
I'll tell you mine.
Tell us yours.
Mine is the Ian Miller covers to the Werewolf Principle by.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, it's a pan lozenge. Yeah. So I've
lozenge.
read that one. Yeah, I don't think I've got it anymore actually. But yeah,
I
that's
buy every
really
single
good.
copy I could.
Yeah.
I love it so much.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We'll try and flash that up on the screen here and now. It's really tough to say. It's hard to pick just one, but I think the pan lozenge series from the late 70s and 80s with a little silver lozenge, I've done a video about my collection of those. I love all of those. And in terms of a traditional cover, there's the one for the Green Hills of Earth by Robert Heinlein, which looks like this. But probably in terms of combining a great cover with a great book, it would be the pan lozenge of Christopher Priest's A Dream of Wessex, which I think was the first Chris Priest I bought, and I bought it because of the cover, and it looks like this. Moving on.
Okay, we'll combine a couple.
Okay.
What or who did you not rate previously but appreciate now? Books, authors, musicians, etc. And conversely, who do you think is overrated?
Oh, okay, well I know part of that is from Tracy Madden. Hi Tracy, I hope to send the video with her up to you in Edinburgh sometime later this year. So she's, I'm out from under her feet and vice versa, and you can show her around the city. So hi. It's difficult to say. I think my critical standards settled in fairly early. I'm all about biases, of course, with SF specifically because I started off reading people who are really good writers, you know, people like Wells, Wyndham, Pierre Boulle, Conan Doyle. So I developed a, you know, sort of English sort of literary sensibility quite quickly. So, you know, I was hard to please when I was sort of starting to read adult novels and adult SF in my early teens. You know, and I think the person who I underrated the most back in those days, and now I completely revere, is Robert Silverberg. I mean, the first Robert Silverberg I read was Tower of Glass, which is a great book. And I think Blade Runner 2049 is more like Tower of Glass than it is like Duanero's Dream of Electric Sheep. And I'm hoping that Gollancz Masterworks will bring that back into print, and I do need to reread it. That's a great one. And then I read The Man in the Maze, which I enjoyed, but I wasn't sort of quite blown away by. And I think I was in the thrall of Philip K. Dick then. And then a few years later, late 80s, I read A Time of Changes by Robert Silverberg, which I absolutely loved, and it completely blew me away. But I didn't have my real Silverberg moment until I would say around about the turn of this century, when I was working with a friend of mine called Simon Hemmings, who does some of the music for my channel. Hi Simon, he's a great guy, he lives in Colorado these days. And he was just getting into SF when we worked together as booksellers. And he revived my interest in it, because I'd gone through quite a long period where I was reading about SF and thinking about it, but I wasn't actually reading the genre very much because I'd got fed up with it. And, you know, recommending stuff to Simon and seeing his enthusiasm got me back into it. And my big Silverberg moment came then. And with Silverberg, it's all about choosing the right moment. In other genres, it's hard to say because, of course, you know, you sort of acquire and watch and listen to and read so much. But somebody with film, I mean, I do like horror cinema, and Lucio Fulci, I used to regard as a hack. Though I was always quite fond of Zombie 2, Zombie Flesh Eaters, as it's called in the UK. And, you know, I have got more enamoured of Fulci's work as time has gone on. Not all of it. I tend to prefer the more fantastic stuff. Things like City of the Living Dead and The Beyond have grown in my estimation. They still have crudities in them, but I enjoy those a lot now. There must be lots of other things, but I might try and think about this a bit more and sort of put some comments in. But thanks to Tracy for that. In terms of overrated is a loaded one, because when I think something's overrated, I'm always thinking about comparisons, and I'm very much a guy who tends to think, I don't think because something's popular is bad. A lot of popular things are really good, which is why they're popular. But a lot of popular things are popular because people don't know any better. And I know that sounds terribly elitist, but there is a place for elitism in criticism. And I think if I think something is overrated, I think it's overrated in comparison to something else. So if I take Dune, for example, I think Dune's overrated both as a book. I think I haven't seen the new film, I'm not really that interested. But it's just because these things are talked about so much. And SF's like this. You hear an awful lot about Dune, you heard a lot about Foundation, you hear a lot about Stranger in a Strange Land, a lot about these things. And because they were big bestsellers and really popular, people assume they're the best. But I mean, I think I did a video very early on in the channel where I said, if you're bored with Dune, read Involution Ocean by Bruce Sterling, which is like, has a lot of the themes of Dune, strange planet, strange people, a drug at the centre of it, and it's very, very short. It's like a punk version of Dune. And also Silverberg's Time of Change, as I mentioned, has that kind of sort of psychedelic aspect which Dune has. So usually if I think things are overrated, I think they're overrated in comparison to things that I think people would enjoy if they tried them. And part of the problem of obscurity is often there's stuff which is really, really great, and it hasn't had its day in the sun. And I think something that marks my career as a bookseller is that, you know, I often say to people, I don't read bestsellers very much. And that's because I'm immersed in it. I'm there every day. I've done it for nearly 40 years. So I get to see everything. And I've always had that thing where I'd like to dive underneath the surface and see what's underneath the rocks, turn them over. So, you know, I think there's lots of things which are popular or overrated. but they're overrated in relation to other things. So I would say, for example, if you're reading SF for the first time, I'd say don't read Dune. If you want to read about transcendence, power, those sort of themes, read Silverberg. I mean, read something like The Time of Changes or The Book of Skulls. They're shorter books, they're better written in terms of quality. I mean, in Dune, the best idea in Dune is the one that's barely mentioned. I mean, if you think about why is the future in Dune like a medieval Renaissance Italy? You know, how does that happen? Where's the computers? Where's the machines? And of course, there's something called the Butlerian Jihad, and it's referred to in the appendix, which happens before Dune, where there's been a war against machines and men, against AIs and people. And mankind narrowly wins, and that's why they have the mentats, so you can't have computers because they're too dangerous. So it's quite an interesting thing to do. That's very clever. So he wrote that sort of possibility of an AI singularity out of his future history before people like Vernor Vinge had really defined a singularity. So there's clever stuff in it, but I like clever stuff conceptually with what I consider good writing, which has a bit of style and flash and economy. So I think most of the really famous books and most of the really famous writers in SF particularly are overrated in comparison to things which are not so well known. This will emerge more as I do my season 100 must-read science fiction novels, and I do more top 10s or what have you, and talk more about the genre theoretically. It'll come forward that a wider conceptual view is needed. You can't assume that what's popular is always good. Doesn't mean there isn't, but often it isn't, and there are better things hiding under the surface.
On a slightly different tack, about collecting books, starting off. How do you? Any tips for starting off to collect books? Mistakes to avoid, approaches to take.
Right. Well, I think with collecting, you decide yourself what you collect, how you do it. There's two basic approaches. I think there's the sort of collecting that comes from completism, where you must have a set of something, or you must have everything by a certain author. And I think that comes from other forms of collecting, like when you're a kid, you collect bubblegum cards or football stickers or what have you, where there's a numbered series. And there's a lot of that in vintage paperback collecting, where people, they buy things which are not in good condition. They just buy things to fit, so they've got, I've got the lot of these, whatever, blah blah. I don't collect that way. I fell into collecting basically when I started bookselling, because I decided that when I started working in the trade and I got a discount, that I would buy hardcover books by my favourite authors as they came out. And that was the start of what I regard as my collecting. I have a library, within that there's a collection. So I think it was Michael Moorcock's The Opium General was the first thing I bought that way. And that was the beginning of my hardcover SF collection. So it was very much the books I was wanted to read by authors I liked, and then I backtrack a bit and bought some sort of things secondhand from the past and what have you. So you decide what you want to do. If you collect hardcovers, the conventions are you go for the best possible condition, you go for first editions. The term first edition is a misleading one, because what it really means is first impression. Edition refers to the content of a book. Now, novels are rarely revised, so every novel that doesn't get revised is a first edition, because edition is about the content. It's just what printing it is. So collectors really should use the word first printing, because lots of books will say first edition on the back of the full title page, on the colophon, the printing history. And then underneath you'll see a line of numbers, and I'm not talking about the ISBN number, I'm talking about numbers which go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And if there's a 1 missing from that line, and there's a 2 there, then it's a second printing. If there's a 1 there, it's a first printing. So it's that sort of thing. So that's something to look out for. What I would say is shop around. If you are looking for condition, you can find things in good condition at reasonable prices. Some dealers are more expensive than others. I would say if you're buying on eBay or Etsy, anything like that, a lot of people don't post photographs of spines, ask for spine pictures. Don't be afraid to ask questions. You are the customer. But and also don't go mad. Space is a thing. Money is a thing. So, you know, decide on your limits, and you can't buy everything. Some people try to, but I think what you get then is you get an unfocused thing. My collection is growing a little bit more unfocused because a new phase is coming, which is nostalgia buying, right? Buying things that I remember selling years ago and they bring back a warm glow. And they're not essentially things I would essentially read. But I think if you stick to what you read as your first principle and see how you go, manufactured rarity, limited editions, I would say the real limited edition books, which are worth getting, are things which, you know, I mean, you've got Subterranean. I mean, they do beautiful stuff, but they're usually reprints of books which people have missed out the first time around. Do you need to do that thing where you have your finger on the pulse? I don't think it's that important, you know. Sometimes it's better to wait until something's reputation is settled. So you decide, you know, look things over carefully, shop around, ask questions, and, you know, find your own parameters for collecting, because it's all about you.
Okay, how about this one? Same person, Matthew Manning. He says, are there any guides or reference books you suggest people to turn to after your most excellent 100 must-read books?
That's very kind of you, Matthew. I would say there are, yeah. I'm going to do a video just about reference books at one point, and I would say the most important thing is to get yourself a copy of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction by Clewton Nichols. Now, it's a website now, it's free, you can access it. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the website because I'm not sure who is in charge of a lot of the editorial things now. So have a look at it, but it is absolutely fantastic. The first edition came out about 78, 79, and then the second revised edition came out in 93, and that's a hardcover. And I'll go through the 93 one, you know, really regularly. The beauty of having it as a book, and okay, it's out of date because it's 93, is that you get the context and you go from one thing to another. So it is like having the hyperlinks on the website, but because it's bounded and finite, you know, you read bits of it and you build up a sort of image of what SF was in that period up to 93, and you know, that's sort of important contextual reading. My book tries to give a context. My book was quite inspired by David Pringle's book, 100 Best SF Novels, which goes from 1945 up to 1984. I'm not sure it's still in print. You know, David is a great guy. He edited into his own magazine for years. Like me, he's a contributor to Deep Ends. He's a fantastic chap. Great SF historian. He was J.G. Ballard's archivist, which, you know, is quite a job. And, you know, that's a really good one. I wanted my book to be more like that, but there were restraints on the format, on the length and what have you, because of course, you know, publishers, they will tell you what they want, and you know, they will let you go so far. You know, I'd have begged my editor for another 1,000 words. She let me have, I couldn't get another 10,000 words, which I would have liked. So David's book is really good, and he does say best, and it's a personal choice, and he has got very good taste. And then there's a book which is called 101 Best Science Fiction Novels, and it goes from 1985 to 2010, and that's by Paul DeFilippo, another Deep Ends contributor, funny enough, and Damien Broderick, the Australian SF writer. And that's really good for what sort of happened, you know, in the last sort of years since the Pringle one. So between the three of us, you've got quite a good range there, and that's a great one. There's a lot of stuff I haven't read yet. It really does put into context a lot of what's happened in SF between 85 and 2010. And, you know, those are the things I would cite. We mentioned the science fiction source book, which is on the video I did at my friend Graham's house, the stunning SF collection. And there are others, and there will be a video coming out just about them.
Do you have a favourite SF film or TV series?
This is a different one because I'm always saying I don't really like science fiction cinema or science fiction television, and of course I've got loads and loads of Blu-rays and DVDs of science fiction films, you know, so I do like science fiction cinema. Science fiction on television, I generally don't like series, because I think the trouble with series is they go on and on and on and on. What you need is a good story arc that has a beginning with a paradigm shift, so you're introduced into a new world by, you know, some technological thing, some sort of trope, and then at the end you have conceptual breakthrough, the world's turned upside down, which I really like. And you tend not to get in series, you tend to get the same as the thing. I mean, Star Trek, Star Trek, the way he was a lot ahead of his time in all sorts of ways. But it did get into that formula of they go to a planet, they go down to the planet, the guy with the red shirt gets killed, you know, they explores the archetypes of the three male central characters, what have you. And it's fine, but, you know, I like something as a beginning, a middle and an end. And if you look at really great science fiction writers like Philip K. Dick, Robert Silverberg, J.G. Ballard, Ursula Le Guin, their stories have a beginning, a middle and an end. And it's that thing about changing the world in the course of one story. So if I did have to say science fiction series, apparently, like, you know, pretty much all of us, you know, born within a certain time frame, our first experience of SF is on television or cinema. And apparently when I was very small, I was really enamoured of a series called Adam Adamant, which was about a Victorian character who was thrust forward into the 60s. He's in hypersleep and he wakes up and he's dressed in Edwardian garb. And I have seen one episode in recent years, and I have no memory of this, but according to my parents, I absolutely loved it and I was riveted by it. And I was probably about 3 or something. So that was a science fiction series, so there you go. But if I had to pick one science fiction series, I would say it would be the Nigel Neal Quatermass series, which unfortunately, the first series of Quatermass, the Quatermass Experiment, only 2 episodes survive. There's a film of it which isn't that great. Quatermass 2 you can get its entirety and it's fantastic. There's a film of it which is not bad. Then you get the Quatermass in the Pit, which is brilliant, and there's a good film of that as well. You can get all these things on DVD. And then in the late 70s there was the 4th Quatermass story, which is just called Quatermass. I call it Quatermass 4. There's a short cinema version called the Quatermass Conclusion. That's been released on Blu-ray. It looks like this. And it's absolutely brilliant. And they're all alien encounters with a rocket scientist on Earth, and they're superb. And Neil really, really was something very special. I'll talk about him at length at some point. So that would be TV. Film. You know, there's lots of things I like. Obviously, like Alien has a sort of raw power to it, you know, and you know, lots of the classic 50s SF films, 2001, lots of those things. 50s and 70s, both great times for SF films. But if I had to name one person as the best science fiction filmmaker, I think in the history of the genre, it's David Cronenberg. I'm very excited about Crimes of the Future coming out in a couple of months' time. And, you know, he gets framed as body horror. And of course, I said horror isn't a genre. You get horror in all sorts of things, in crime, in SF, and fantasy. But, you know, there's a body of work in Cronenberg from the very beginning, from his short films right through things like Stereo, the original Crimes of the Future, Shivers, Rabid, The Brood, most of all Videodrome. If I had to name one science fiction film, even above, say, The Man Who Fell to Earth or A Clockwork Orange, which are both superb, I would say probably Videodrome is my favourite SF film. It has a certain sensibility which is very new wave, very cyberpunk. It has amazing dialogue, shocking, stunning special effects, high concept, and yet it is a very Dickian thing of a conflict between 2 different sort of groups, a bit like Ubik, you know. In recent years, I think the best science fiction film I've seen this century is Primer, which isn't for everybody. It's a time travel film, but I think that's absolutely stunning. Good little film called Coherence. In terms of more space opera-y things, I think, you know, there's an awful lot of running around corridor films. It's not going on that way. So, you know, in terms of a more traditional thing, I can't think of anything that's really brought me away of late.
Okay.
Okay.
You mentioned Christopher Priest as your favourite living SF author.
Yes.
So who is the equivalent of those who have passed?
Well, it's easy to say who your favourite is when you have fewer favourites. And as I say, I think since the early 90s, science fiction has produced fewer geniuses. There's that period, the Renaissance sort of period when, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when it just pumped out geniuses and a lot of really good second level writers. But I would say until he died, Ballard was probably the best because he changed science fiction. He merged it with the mainstream. He showed that, you know, it was a valid point of looking at the contemporary world. He wasn't always my favourite writer in terms of style and what have you, even though I do love his stuff. But it's hard to say. I mean, in my early days of reading SF, I completely revered John Wyndham. I still think John Wyndham was really important, really good. He brought something to it which nobody else did. You know, you get people like in the 50s, Alfred Bester. People talk about the novels a lot, about The Demolished Man and Tiger, which these days people call The Stars My Destination. I prefer the more Blakey English title, Tiger, which he hasn't had for years, ironically. But it's the short stories of Bester. Like Harlan Ellison's a really important writer to me, especially in the 1960s. In terms of female writers, I think Ursula K. Le Guin, you know, is impeccable. But favourites is hard. I guess I have favourite books rather than favourite writers. But you know, there's no doubt that Chris is my favourite living writer, very much so. When I first read his book, The Glamour, back in, it came out 84, 85, it just sort of completely changed my life and my way of looking at things. And even though I read similar things by Philip K. Dick, Priest has a kind of maturity of style and flatness and you know, complete way of turning reality on its head, which is just absolutely brilliant. So so I guess Ballard before that. You know, there's a lot of great stuff out there, and I like lots of mainstream writers. You know, there's all sorts of people who work in the mainstream I really like. But yeah, I would say before Priest it would be Wyndham, you know, Bester, Ellison, Dick. You know, going way back, I mean, I think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's amazing. Going really way much further back, I think Beowulf is great. So you know, it's hard to pin down a favourite.
Okay, you've mentioned on your channel about selling books, especially on your visits to Hay on Wye. So where do you sell your duplicate books that you do not have room for?
Well, I say I do a selling at Hay on Wye every couple of years. I like to go once a year. I've been going for a long time, so a couple of places they know me. When somebody's buying books secondhand, when a dealer or secondhand books was buying, they're looking for quality, you know, so they are looking for things which are good. They're looking for things in good condition if possible, because they know they can charge more money for them. They're looking for stuff which is saleable. I mean, certain books are out there in huge amount of copies, and I'll just tell you a story about David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas. David Mitchell, a hell of a nice guy if you meet him, he's lovely, but Cloud Atlas is really, really popular. It's got an SF strand in it, which makes it an SF novel, and it was so popular, you know, lots of great reviews and loads of people bought it, but a lot of people obviously didn't like it because you saw loads in the charity shops. And the guy who, this is a story, a friend of a friend, this guy who's in charge of sort of acquiring books, I think, for either Dorothy House or Oxfam, I can't remember which of the two, and he sent a message out to all the branches of the charity shop: don't take any more donations of David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, because we've got so many and we can't sell them. So, you know, if there's something really, really, really popular, like if you've got a pile of Agatha Christie's, you know, they'll probably want them. But if this is a bestseller from a year ago, which was hyped and people bought in huge amounts, they're probably not that interested. So, you know, if you're going to try and sell to a second-hand bookshop, whatever, get in touch with them first. Say, are you buying at the moment? This is the kind of thing I've got. Are you interested? Don't waste their time, because you see people turning up with all sorts of stuff. You see them turning up, people think just because a book is old that it's valuable. It's not. It doesn't matter how old it is. You know, if you're talking about a Gutenberg Bible, it's different. But if it's something that they want and there's demand for it, so I do that. I sell things on eBay, same as everybody does. Sometimes they just sit there, sometimes they don't. I try not to charge excessive prices. I don't do auctions. I'll give you an example. I sold a signed first edition of Christopher Fowler's Full Dark House the other day. First Bryant May books. It's a crime novel, not an SF novel. And you know, you see copies of that. I mean, unsigned is quite sort of common, but signed and in really good nick is not. And if you look at the sold prices on eBay and eBay, you'll see people paying like 50, 100 quid or more. I put it on for 50, I thought it was a bit high. I knocked it down to 42 and I sold it the next day. So you've got to be realistic. Not everybody's going to pay out for something, you know. And, you know, usually it's I want to get the money in quickly, you know, other things. So I do that. That's pretty much it, really. I mean, if you look at Bookpilled, if you look at Matt in San Diego, hey Matt, you know, he does Etsy, you know, he does a channel on thrifting. So I think now that the internet's there, you know, there's all sorts of avenues. And the good doctor who's interviewing me here today, he has a rather wonderful eBay comic store, which I might stick a link in if you're interested in comics, because he knows how to grade, he has great stuff. So there you go. So yeah, it's online mostly.
I was curious about your thoughts about A Stranger in a Strange Land. It's kind of an unconventional SF classic. You touched on it earlier, but...
Yeah, it's a funny one, because Stranger in a Strange Land, it is unconventional in all sorts of ways, you know, because it was such a bestseller, because it was such a popular book, and a book which helped change the nature of publishing, I can't see it as unconventional. I will admit I'm not a massive fan of Heinlein. I mean, the first time I read Heinlein was, I would have been about 13 or 14, and I read I Will Fear No Evil, which is one of the later bigger Heinleins. And the sort of chapter and verse for Heinlein is the early stuff's good, the later stuff after Stranger gets bloated, and he just uses it as a platform for his opinions. He speaks through Jubal Harshaw and all these other characters, and there's a certain amount of truth in that. I have no problem with that. But I remember reading I Will Fear No Evil, which is a stunning cover with a skull on it, an NEL one, and I thought, this is exciting. And I found it really prurient. It's about a sort of very rich character in the future, and he's dying, and he gets his consciousness transferred into the body of his young secretary who's been in an accident, and there's a kind of sort of sexual element in that, and which is inevitable, but it's the sort of thing that somebody like Dick or Silverberg would do with a kind of cool irony, whereas in Heinlein it felt very prurient, and I really didn't like it, and I didn't find it very sophisticated. And I think, as I say, then I was reading people like Dick, Ellison, Silverberg, Bester, who I think, you know, say a lot more with a lot less. So Stranger in Strange Land I've read a couple of times. I struggle with it both times. It's obviously a very influential book, and I don't really like it. It's not really for me. The Heinlein I like, I tend to like, I'm a big fan of Orphans of the Sky, Generation Starship novel, which I think is great, one of the early Generation Starship books. And of course the two-headed mutant character Joe Jim in that is parodied as Zaphod Beeblebrox in Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm also a big fan of Puppet Masters, which I think is great and exciting. I do like Starship Troopers, but I'm not so keen on the big Heinleins. I've got some of them because I used to sell them, and I've got real fondness for their liveries and jackets. I'd love a nice copy of Time Enough for Love. And I do like the tiles. They're very evocative tiles, a lot of them. But Stranger, it's very messianic, and it got picked up in the 60s. People were grokking each other. It allegedly influenced Charles Manson. Not essentially a good thing, but you can't blame a writer for that. And I don't know, it never really did it for me. But I'm going to try and read it for a third time one day. So it's an unconventional book because it's messianic, but at the same time it's a conventional one because it's so popular. And the way it changed publishing is alongside Lord of the Rings and Dune, all very big books. It's not that they weren't big books before that, they were. I mean, Moby Dick's a big book, there's lots of big classics. But it was those three books, Stranger, Lord of the Rings and Dune, which said to publishers, people want width, not essentially quality. And if you like that, then I do apologize, it's all a matter of personal taste. But this is why books are so big now. Publishing was more conservative then, but they picked these things up, and now this is why most books are too long. And I see Strangers being one of those books which prompted that, and unfortunately that probably wasn't Heinlein's thing. And once he had that as a bestseller, when you become a really popular author, this happened to Stephen King, it happened to J.K. Rowling, you notice the books get bigger and bigger and bigger because the publishers won't edit them because one, they think they're going to sell anyway, and two, they're afraid to in case the author gets fed up. Like you hear about the uncut version of The Stand. The editor probably thought there's too much of this. So, the edited version, I think it happened with Stranger as well. It didn't it? Happen with Stranger as well. So, often those things were pared down for a good reason. So I can't say I'm a fan, I'm afraid. So apologies for that. But as I say, it's probably okay in itself, but there are probably other things which are more interesting, which, may be more ignored. Let's look at an example like Andy Weir if you talk about what's the big Andy Weir book, the best-selling one? The Martian. I'm on holiday, so I put everything in the cupboard. You know, people write about The Martian. If you talk to certain science fiction writers, they say, "Oh, the science in this is crap. It's not real science." When I picked up The Martian, I immediately thought of Shipwreck by Charles Logan, which came out in 1975, which is far braver and more original, because it's a guy, you know, his spaceship's crashed on a planet and he's on his own. How's he going to survive? And you know, he doesn't, is the thing. He dies, and that's the end of Charles Logan's career. But it's a very brave book, and it's really well written, and the sort of picture of alien life on this world and what have you. So it's very downbeat, but it's really sort of like, God, it's really, you know, it's a really challenging thing to do. Good grief, he just let the character die. My God, you know, this is shocking, you know, and that's what SF is out. It's the bucket of water in the face rather than the warm glow. We all like the warm glow now and again, but it's good to have the bucket of water in the face occasionally, you know. So, yeah.
This might take some time.
Okay.
Your top 10 personal favourite science fiction novels?
Oh God, is that from Matt?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
He wants to know your 10, 20 or 30.
Yeah, doesn't he say something else as well? I mean, I love Matt. I'll do anything for Matt. He's the man. But that's
we'll stick with top 10.
Top 10.
Top 5?
Okay. Well, this is completely without any planning, off the top of my head. And favourite or best in terms of enjoyment. First of all, I'm going to name two things. This is not in any ranking, which are not novels. And I put these in 100 must-read science fiction novels, even though they're not novels, because short stories are a very, very, very important part of the form. And I would say possibly my favourite science fiction book in terms of genre SF is The Dark Side of the Earth by Alfred Bester, which is a collection of 7 short stories. My father bought me my copy way back in the late 70s. I had no idea who Bester was. He didn't either, but he had good instincts when buying books for me. And I think that's word perfect. I prefer those stories to anything else that Bester wrote. I would say Harlan Ellison's collection, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, is sublime, and that contains the fantastic novella Boy and His Dog. That's not, it's only been in print, in sort of print on demand editions and stuff. In my time in bookselling, there used to be a pan lozenge. I mean, if there were 2 books I would love to be in print and to sell regularly to science fiction readers, it would be those 2. The best stories date from the 50s to early 60s. I think one of them is early 60s. The Allisons in 1960s, 70s. Those are important books to me. John Wyndham, The Midwich Cuckoos, I think is his finest book. Wyndham was, you know, one of my first loves. I think that's really important. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is seminal, and my favourite Wells, I would say. Neuromancer by William Gibson, I read more or less every year. I get something different out of every time. I think it's probably the most important science fiction of the last 40 years. The Glamour by Christopher Priest is amazing, fantastic book, changed my life. I like all of Chris's stuff, but that's a good one. I would say, how many have I done? 6. Have I done 6? Philip K. Dick. It's an obvious one, but it would be Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, because it was the first Dick I read. This was 5 years or so before the film, mind you. I just picked up the title, and I do like a lot of Dick stuff. I'm very keen on Radio Free Albemarle. I'm very keen on Ubik, Time Out of Joint. I mean, there's at least 10 masterpieces. So Do Androids Dream would be there. With Robert Silverberg, The Book of Skulls, because I can't decide whether it's an SF novel, whether it's a fantasy novel or a mainstream novel, because it doesn't contain the information if you can pin it down, which is what makes it so brilliant. I like that a lot. I really, really love Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, but the 1818 text rather than the revised 1831 one. The 1831 one is great, that was the first one I read, but the 1818 is rawer and harsher, and I think it's probably got a bit more Percy in it, more Percy Shelley in it, but that's, you know, that's a contentious point. Those are good ones. So is that 9? Have I done 9? I think it's easy for me to pick actually my favourite novel, and for me the best science fiction novel I've ever read. And it's you know, it's going to be on everybody's list, and that's 1984 by George Orwell. I don't normally go for world building, but I think the world building in 1984, not just the physical stuff, but the political stuff, the language, everything, is just so amazing. Because yeah, he wrote it as a warning, he wrote it as a work of art, but it's incredible. There's all those little details. There's a video in the early days of the channel about 1984 as science fiction. There's little things like, there's little lines like when the atomic bomb fell on Colchester, you know, there's stuff like that, the floating fortresses, and you get the impression that the floating fortresses aren't ships, but they're somehow bolted to the floor of the ocean and they stay in place. And there's Newspeak, the telescreen, and you know, this terrifying dystopian vision of the future. And I love Orwell's prose anyway. I'd read all of Orwell's work by the time I was about 21, 22. I've read most of it multiple times. I'm a huge fan of his novel Coming Up for Air. So I guess that's probably it. I think apart from Shelley, I haven't mentioned any women, which is bad. But so I'm going to mention one of my favourite female science fiction writers. I'm going to mention two because I think it's important. Now, historically, of course, there weren't many women writing genre SF. There were some, but there weren't many. It was a bit of a boys' club until the 60s. Brian Aldiss said that science fiction wouldn't really have a claim to maturity until as many men and women in equal numbers read and wrote it. He does have a point, though historically women have been unlucky and the men got the jump on them. So to mention two female science fiction writers, C.L. Moore, Catherine Lucille Moore, who was active in the 30s onwards. I think she's just brilliant. I mean, of the sort of pre-Golden Age writers, who were nonetheless genre writers, I prefer C.L. Moore over everybody. I think Northwest Smith, you know, those stories are amazing. Shambler, they're great. And they're so sort of sensual and colourful and contemporary. Somebody who has produced a small amount, and she has unpublished books, is Lee Kennedy. I think the Journal of Nicholas the American is fantastic. It's never had a paperback publication in the UK. Her stories in Faces are fantastic as well. So Lee Kennedy, I'd like to sort of, you know, give a mention to as well. Two questions that the good doctor didn't squeeze in, but were nonetheless on the list, and maybe he couldn't see them on his tablet. But so I popped these in at the end. So they were pretty much all SF questions. One rock and roll question, but that's related to SF. So I'll tackle that one first. And somebody asked about my interest in the rock band Hawkwind, the ultimate science fiction band. What was my first LP, first gig, what have you? Well, my first hearing of Hawkwind, I've said this, I'm sure in one of the Hawkwind videos, but I'll say it again, was hearing the single Silver Machine back in 1972, when I would have been 9, coming up to 10, and, you know, it was the sound of the synth at the beginning, and it just sounded amazing. So that was the first thing. Then I didn't really listen to Hawkwind again until round about 82, when a friend of mine bought the Masters of the Universe compilation. I was around his house and he said, "Do you remember Hawkwind?" Played it and I was sold. And then I went out and bought Astounding Sounds, Amazing Music, and then, you know, the following week about 4 Hawkwind albums, and that was it. And I first saw them on the Earth Ritual preview tour. I think that would have been spring 1984, Cardiff St David's Hall. Nick Turner, Dead Fred, Dave Brock, Harvey Bainbridge, Hugh Lloyd Langton, not sure who the drummer was on that gig. Really, really great. I was dressed as Jerry Cornelius, of course. I couldn't pull that off and I'm too fat. There is a story where, you know, Mike does say that Jerry's fat, so he's not always thin. And so that's that really. That's my Hawkwind sort of thing. I know Matt from Bookbuild also asked, what are my interests in right-wing SF? What do I think of it? Well, I think like Matt and like most SF readers, I'm left-wing. I see politics that way in terms of right and left-wing as being a matter of economics rather than anything else. I am interested in right-wing SF because I'm interested in SF as a thought experiment. I think the problem with politics now is everything's so polarised. Everybody feels they have to take up a position, that they can't sort of go beyond it, that they have to follow, you know, dogma and ideology you know, dogmatically and not sort of show any independent thought and not really think through arguments and evidence. The trouble is most right-wing SF isn't very well written. It's often polemical. Heinlein, you know, we're going to polemic, Niven and Pornell. Though, you know, Niven and Pornell, you can say what you like, but, you know, you name two other white science fiction writers who collaborated with a black science fiction writer, with Stephen Barnes, so there you go. So I'm only really interested in them for nostalgia reasons. I haven't read any for a long time. I do have fond memories of selling those books. But, you know, Larry Niven was the enemy to us new wave guys, you know, and same with Heinlein. So I guess if I had to name a book which is often called a right-wing SF novel as an interesting one, I think Starship Troopers is interesting. It's the idea of the Republic and, you know, you pay in and what have you. And, of course, it's set in South America, which, you know, people felt would be the thing in the future. Maybe it will be yet. And the central character is a person of colour, not a white person. So, you know, that's quite interesting. But, you know, I don't really think of SF in that way. I think of it more as, you know, there are solid left-wing writers I like. You know, people like Richard Morgan, for example, George Orwell. You know, Michael Moorcock's always pretty been left-wing, sort of sort of liberal anarchist sort of thing was his thing for a long time in the 70s and 80s. But yeah, I guess that's it. And things like the Turner Diaries, now they don't really interest me at all because they're usually really badly written. You know, that's the thing. Who is underrated? Who do I think is underrated? Well, I would say everybody who's not popular now. You know, in SF, it's this. You know, a lot of writers who you haven't heard of, or maybe you haven't read, I haven't read, often have great critical reputations if you look in the reference books and talk to critics and other writers. But of course, you know, they're not always popular. I mean, there are always things which are popular now, and they're usually people who are around and writing now, because of course that's what publishers are promoting. You know, publishers obsess this idea of the new. You know, and there's the books of the moment and the books of all time. I'm not sure if Goethe said that. Maybe it was Rousseau. Maybe it was Voltaire. I can't remember. Maybe it was none of those guys. But, you know, I would say there's lots of people who are underrated. You know, I could name any number of literary SF authors I think are underrated. But they're not underrated by critics. They're just less well known. I'll cover a lot of those people on the channel because, you know, I think there's a lot more interest in obscure SF than people realise, I think. I've certainly noticed with Matt at Science Fiction Reads, hi Matt, that his most popular video is about the obscure writers, the writers he felt were obscure, which was interesting. It shows people have a hunger to get beyond the obvious, which is great. You know, that's what I want to see people go beyond. Never mind the big four, Heinlein, Asimov, Clarke, you know, what have you. Herbert, you know, they're fine if you want to read that sort of thing, but there's more to SF than that. Finally, who are my favourite sort of anthologists and editors? Well, you know, there have been some great ones in SF and they have shaped things, but I have to say they would be magazine editors who really sort of nurtured things. And I would say in the 1950s, Galaxy, when it was edited by Horace L. Gold. Now, he had a terrible reputation of rewriting, changing titles, drove writers mad. But under his leadership, you know, the magazine was fantastic. It was great 50s American social SF, you know, and influenced people like J.G. Ballard, who had a more literary sensibility. Kingsley Amis was very interested in Galaxy. You know, Galaxy did some great stuff. So I would say Horace L. Gold. He was agoraphobic. He really went out of his apartment. He used to do everything by telephone and in person. And I would have to say, you know, above and beyond that, it has to be Michael Moorcock from New Worlds. I mean, New Worlds, you know, is for me the seminal thing that drew the new wave together. You can talk about Harlan Ellison and Dangerous Visions, but, you know, the new wave in Britain and America was two different things. I think the key American new wave writers who really wanted to shake things up all wrote for New World. Some of them moved to London to be there. Dish, Sladek, you know, Delaney did stuff for New Worlds, Ellison. But, you know, I think Moorcock, you know, he took Ballard and William S. Burroughs and he merged them with traditional SF by people like E.C. Tubb and, you know, raved about the sort of the beauty of people like Charles Harness's work, things like that. So yeah, it has to be Moorcock for me. So thanks for that. If I didn't answer any questions, I do apologise. Do let me know in the comments and I'll aim to answer you personally. Thanks for that. Bye for now.